Leadership in Education Sciences in the Contemporary Thought Leaders class is honored to welcome our guest author for this evening, Dr. Jean Lipman-Blumen. Dr. Lipman-Blumen is the Thornton F. Bradshaw Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Drucker and Ito Graduate School of Management, Claremont Graduate University. In addition to her professional roles at Claremont Graduate University, Dr. Lipman-Blumen is the co-founding director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Leadership, as well as a director of Achieving Styles Institute. Dr. Lipman-Blumen is an organizational sociologist and a social psychologist who received her PhD from Harvard University and both her AB and AM degrees from Wellesley College. She also spent 2 postdoctoral years of study in mathematics, statistics, and computer science at Carnegie Mellon and Stanford Universities. Dr. Lipman-Blumen's impressive work resume includes extensive work in education, consulting, and government. Her experience includes the Executive Office of the President, the Departments of State, Labor, Health and Human Services, Agriculture, and Education. I've already got it written. I'm an old Marine, I gotta do this.
Okay.
She's consulted to various foreign governments, including those of Sweden, Norway, Great Britain, Thailand, Egypt, and Bulgaria. Her teaching interests and area of expertise include leadership, achieving styles, crisis management, organizational behavior, and gender roles. Current research interests include connective leadership in a diverse and interdependent world, why followers tolerate toxic leaders, leadership rhetoric and illusions, and a practical theory of crisis management. Dr. Lipman-Blumen is the author of 6 books, 3 monographs, and more than 70 journal articles and chapters in other authors' volumes. Her works have been published in such noted journals as the Scientific American, the Harvard Business Review, and the Harvard Educational Review, among others. In addition to her work at Claremont Graduate University, Dr. Lipman-Blumen sits on various boards spanning a wide variety of interests. The book we're discussing tonight, The Allure of Toxic Leaders, Why We Follow Destructive Bosses and Corrupt Politicians, and How We Can Survive Them, was cited as one of the top business books of 2004. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lipman-Blumen.
Thank you.
Well, that's a long way from statistics to...
Well, I started as an English major, so I don't know. That's sort of from the ridiculous to the sublime, or vice versa, whichever way you want to look at it.
Well, we're certainly glad you're with us here tonight, and thank you for this book. This book, I have said publicly, is, in my opinion, the best treatment of this subject that you'll find out there.
Thank you.
So we appreciate your scholarship, and we appreciate all of the machinations that you had to go through in order to get here today. We had quite a time with the airlines within the last 24 hours, but you're here, and that's what's important. Right. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about where this book came from. This book is, there's always some sense of biography or autobiography in the book. All of the books that we've read have had that in common, and I imagine that's the same with this book. Where does this come from?
Well, George, if you had asked me this before this afternoon in our conversation, I would have said that it came from 16 years of observing a toxic leader and wondering why the board in that, he was the leader of the institution, and why the board, once they knew what he was like, once they knew that without question he was indisputably toxic, why they kept him. I would have said that was it, because that really blew my mind. I thought that once the board understood that this person was toxic, they would say, you know, that's it, that's the end of it. But it wasn't, and so that fascinated me, because this person went on for another maybe 8 or 9 years beyond the board's recognition that he was a toxic leader. But George, when we were talking this afternoon, you may recall that I told you the story about my pre-Wellesley job. And I never thought about that as sort of, you know, sand that gets into the oyster and irritates it. But when I had just graduated from high school, between high school and my first year in college, I had a job in a hospital record room, and a woman ran that record room, and there were several people there. There were 3 or 4 people in the record room, plus myself, and they were, in some ways, we wouldn't categorize them really as disabled in today's world, but they had certain kinds of issues, problems that made them more vulnerable, where it was clear it would be hard for them to get jobs in other places. And she was so abusive to them, and what made me even angrier than seeing that, because I didn't know how to help. You know, I could see this happening, and I didn't have a clue as to how to get in front of, between her and them. And what really bothered me was she treated me very well. And I was just summer help. You know, I was a 16-year-old summer help. And I was treated well, and they were the regular people, and they were treated poorly. I mean, really nastily. And I hadn't thought about her in a long time, but I do think that you have experiences in life that sort of catch your attention. And you don't particularly realize it until some much larger expression of that same phenomenon comes into view. And everything that you've been seeing, all these little pieces come together, and you see this thing writ large, and it really commands your attention. And I think watching this person who was this administrator, not the woman that I was just describing, but the 18-year hold-on, watching him be very charismatic, very charming, very eloquent, very learned, and very toxic, very corrupt, was an experience that really intrigued me. And I simply couldn't believe that once, as I said, the board would recognize what the situation was, that they wouldn't do something about it. But do you know what they did? They said, oh, we have to let, let's call him Jim. We have to let Jim be Jim. And what we will do is make this person the outside person, and we'll get somebody else in who will be the inside person, and all these problems will go away. Well, that's a long saga in itself, which we won't go into here because we'd be here till midnight. But that's a long answer. But I think it's just something that has gnawed at me for a long time.
Well, we talked earlier today about elevator speeches, and you don't like them. So I'm not going to ask you to give an elevator speech about your book. But what I am going to...
But anybody else can if you...
Oh, it's just me. I understand. But it might be helpful for people who haven't read the entire book, or who may be watching this tape but haven't had the opportunity to read this book. It covers a lot of ground, but I wonder if you could just help us a little bit with telling people about what the book is about.
Okay. Contrary to what you might think, because it's called The Allure of Toxic Leaders, and people think it, when they pick it up, that it's really all about toxic leaders. It's really about the constituents or the followers or the victims of toxic leaders. And before I forget, I would like to ask you all something. How many of you have personally had experience with a toxic leader in your lifetime? Okay. Look around, everybody. That is the reaction I get most of the time. And it's really very disheartening to me. So I wanted to see if I could understand why, since we are so often faced with toxic leaders, why is it that we don't rise up against them? Why is it that we let them have their way with us and leave in their own sweet time and on their own terms? Because that's what happens most of the time. It is very unusual for toxic leaders to be, brought to account. And so I was trying to understand it from the follower's perspective, not to blame the victim, but to see if I couldn't understand it in a way that would be helpful to people who were experiencing that to get out from under it. And so that's really what the book is about. And it looks at the internal aspects of this, our existential reasons, our psychological, personal reasons, are what I call our psycho-social reasons, those factors that come about from the rub between the individual and his or her environment. And then the situational factors, the environment in which the moment in history in which you happen to live. So I was trying to understand how all these factors conjoin to keep us entrapped by toxic leaders.
There's something actually quite depressing about the notion that given an opportunity to work with an enlightened, beneficial leader, that there are times where we choose the toxic. That depresses me to no end, I have to tell you.
But I think part of it, I hate to say this, but I think a big part of it can be laid at the feet of the media in today's society. I mean, there are these factors within ourselves, and I think they're the most potent. The existential dread, the fear of dying, the yearning for safety, the yearning for somebody to tell you that they can take care of you, that they have things under control, just do what I say and everything will be fine. And all the reasons that come from within us and from our interaction with our own environment. But I also think that the media glorify people like this, that they're charmed by them, and they write about them in what Patty Sellers from, I think she's with the Wall Street Journal, she came to a conference that we ran at the Drucker School on the corporate leaders and the media, how the media define corporate leaders. And she was saying, well, we like to write about rising stars, gurus, and fallen angels. Okay, and so the rising stars are people that the media build up to these great heights. And then the gurus are the ones who have achieved that status, and then the ones who are toppled from grace or the pinnacle, or however you want to look at it. But I think the media look at the superficial aspects of leadership, and they are always seeking charisma. And I used to love Max Weber. When I read Max Weber about charismatic leadership, I was entranced. I thought that was so exciting. But I now tell my students, I'm up to here with charisma. Do not talk to me about charisma unless you can also talk to me about character, about integrity. And if you can't do that, I don't want to hear about charisma. And I don't even want to hear about vision. I want to, I really don't. Because oftentimes, grand illusions masquerade as noble visions. And I think that it's oftentimes very difficult to discern the difference between those two.
An example, perhaps? Maybe somebody you'd like to pull from your book that you think is a quintessential example? We could talk about Hitler. Everybody talks about
Yeah,
Hitler. But I bet you have
but
another example.
Berlusconi, I mean, is the Prime Minister of Italy. I mean, the most narcissistic control freak in the world, well, not in the world, but one of the most. And he has this belief that he is the savior of Italy. There's a quote in the book where a well-known reporter is interviewing Berlusconi at dinner. And it's Berlusconi and 3 of his staff people are there. And Berlusconi is complaining about what a terrible life it is to be the prime minister. You know, how much he's had to give up in order to do this. That he has a yacht, and he hasn't been on the yacht except twice that year. And he has, I don't know, 7 houses or villas, and he hasn't been to any of them, and how terrible it is, and how lonely and depriving it is. And so the reporter says, then, you know, why do you do it? And he says, if I don't do it, who will save Italy? And in a chorus, his assistants sitting at the table say, who else? Who else? So this concept that somebody is going to be your savior, or somebody thinks he or she is going to be your savior, is a very dangerous thing. You know, leaders are not saviors. Noble visions are never solitary enterprises. They're collaborative ventures. They involve many people coming together to make something important and noble happen. And when you hear someone telling you that they can save you, run as fast as your feet can carry you. Okay, that would be my advice.
I'm sure there are some people that have read the book that were not as enamored with it as you and I are. Critics. If you had critics, have you heard from any of them? What if they were in the room, what would they say, and what would you say to them?
The only criticism that I have gotten and that I've seen was a thing on Amazon where someone wrote, of all the books I've ever read on leadership, I thought this was the best until...
There's always something like that, right?
Until I got to page 100 or something, when the writer lost all her credibility by talking about George Bush. And, you know, this was in Bush's first administration, mind you. And the interesting thing was, that brought me up short, because I tried very hard to be respectful and gentle to George Bush, and I felt that I was being an equal opportunity leadership basher, because, you know, I tell my students, I don't take into account party coloration or affiliation when I look at leaders, because I had other equally uncomplimentary things to say about Clinton, even though I thought Clinton brought a lot of gifts to leadership, and that's what made me even madder at him, because I felt he squandered them. He gave them away, you know, so that his second term went down the tubes simply because he gave in to his own private, selfish needs. And I think when you become a leader and you take on the responsibility of making decisions that will affect and taking actions that will affect many other people's lives, that you give up the right to indulge yourself. You know, if he wants to do that as a private person, that's his business, it's not mine. But when he does it and his whole the next 4 years go down the tubes totally, when important things needed to be done and couldn't be done because every time he tried to do them, the press would say, oh, that's the tail wagging the dog. You know that movie where they, you know the movie.
Manufactured
a
conflict.
Right, so that as a distraction. So I was surprised at that, because I thought I was being very gentle. But I felt that it was important to give examples, and he wasn't a big example in the book. I mean, there were far worse characters. He hadn't really revealed himself, to me at least, in his true splendor until sometime later. But I think that it's important to have examples, because otherwise it's too theoretical, it's too abstract. You know, if I am constantly talking about existential angst and how to transform that existential angst and our anxiety into a force for creativity and a force for excitement and new directions and courage and learning, that's too abstract. I mean, I think it really is important, because my predilection is simply to write in terms of the ideas behind this and not to use examples. And it was interesting because this, just on a technical, you know, pragmatic, logistical level, this book was being published by Oxford University Press in the management business book section, which I didn't particularly want it in that section, and I had to write a memo to the editors to convince them to let me use examples from other arenas, because my point was it isn't limited to one part of the society. It's everywhere. It's in education. It's in, you know, it's in the political arena. It's in business. It's in for-profit, not-for-profit. It occurs everywhere because it's an aspect of who we are as people.
I wonder if you might help.
But you may know more, you know, criticism than I do. I think people are not so. I doubt that that person would have written to me directly. I just happened to, you know, for masochistic reasons, be looking at the negative, the negative comments on Amazon.
Well, if you're going to read your own positive press, we should read our own negative press as well.
Well, I don't read that too much either.
Well, talk to us a little bit about toxic leadership. What defines toxic leadership as opposed to run-of-the-mill bad leadership? Is there a difference? Can you?
Yes, absolutely. And I was not writing about ordinary, you know, around the water cooler kind of discussion of bad leaders. From my point of view, toxic leaders inflict serious and enduring harm. They are not ordinary. They are not somebody who yells at you once during the year and then is abjectly apologetic. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who exert and inflict serious and enduring harm to individuals and to institutions. So and probably in other realms as well. I suppose one could say to the environment, to non-humans. And it comes about through the dysfunctional personal characteristics as well as their destructive behavior. So it's both it's both an internal thing in terms of who they are and their character and their personality, and it is projected outward in terms of behavior. So they have serious impact. And I went back and looked up the word toxic, and it means smeared with poison. And I think they do poison the environment. I mean, how many times have you been in or heard of institutions or workplaces where people are miserable and people are sick, they're stressed out, they have all kinds of illnesses, physical illnesses, many of which come from stress. I think it's a serious problem, and it flies under the radar. And I think we take it so for granted that we think that people, particularly people, when we live in a hierarchical society, which we inevitably do, even if we live in a democracy, virtually all of the institutions in which we live, in schools, in businesses, in churches, whatever, they are hierarchies. And I do think that, and we were talking about this earlier today, that when you are at certain levels of the hierarchy, you think that that gives you, it presumably gives you the opportunity to help lead the people at lower levels of the hierarchy. And I think one of the problems comes about because of the way in which we define leadership. We define it as a privilege. And we think that rank has privilege. And we don't think of leadership as a responsibility, as hard work. And that's what it is. It's responsibility and performance. And I think if we rethought that, we would get a very different type of person who comes forward to be a leader. We would have to draft leaders, or the kinds of people who would come forward would be people who had a sense of responsibility for the whole, not for themselves. I mean, right now, a very large proportion of people who seek top leadership positions have a very strong narcissistic component. And if you read Michael Maccabee's work, Michael sort of justifies it, saying, well, here are the good points of working for a narcissistic leader, that they do certain things. Well, there's no question that people who are charismatic, who are visionary, can be very exciting and very entertaining. So we get sucked into that, and we find it exciting to be where they are, to be in their environment, to be in their entourage, perhaps. But I think that it's important for us to think about the selection process. If we changed how we thought about leadership, and we thought about it as a responsibility, and if we thought about the selection process, those two things go together. If we changed the way we select leaders, and if we changed our definition of leadership, then we'd also put much more emphasis on, I don't like the word followership. I'm with Joe Ross. I think the word follower, no one wants to be a follower. I mean, if you ask a room full of kindergartners, how many of you want to grow up to be followers? Not one hand would go up. Okay? But constituents, if we think of people as constituents, and I looked that up finally. You know, there are things that you think, oh, I've got to do that, I've got to do that, and you never do it. Well, I kept thinking I had to look up the word constituents. And having the temerity to think that I was a great Latin scholar, well, maybe I was when I was 12 years old, but I'm not anymore. I thought that it meant to stand together. And that seemed like a reasonable definition. That's not the derivation at all. Constituent means to establish together. Think about that. If we thought of ourselves as people who established an institution or a program or an entity, whatever, together, we would have a sense of ownership in that, a sense of responsibility to make sure that it prospered, would we not? We wouldn't think of ourselves as people who were following what somebody else told us to do. I mean, I looked up the word follower, too. That was so bad. I just did that recently. And all the synonyms for follower, they're to mimic, to imitate, to walk behind. I mean, who would want that as, on their tombstone? I don't think so. I don't think so.
There are so many world-class organizations out there who have so many toxic leaders in their midst. If you were providing advice to chief executive officers who say, look, Gene, I hear what you're saying and I agree with you. We should be able to do a better job at this. What advice would you give them? What how-tos, what tips, techniques would you say? This is what you need to do in your organization.
Well, I think that one of the things I would put immense emphasis upon would be selection, because you have some control over that. When you are hiring people, when you are selecting people, you have control over which one you choose to select. Once that person is part of the organization, it is much, much more difficult to affect change. I mean, after all, it's hard enough to change our own behavior. And that's the only behavior you really can change. You know, and trying to change somebody else's behavior is extremely difficult. Sometimes it happens, but it's a huge amount of effort, a huge amount of work, and you have to be very wise about it. I think you also have to be very clear about the ethos of the organization.
This is how we do things around here.
Right. This is how we do things. And when you see people violating that by their behavior, you say, whoa, that isn't how we act around here. You know, we don't abuse people. We don't publicly berate people. If we have criticism, we couch it in ways that the person can use constructively and by which they're not injured. And I don't mean to be a Pollyanna about this, but I think that when you scream and yell at somebody in a performance review and tell them how bad they are, you don't convince them that they're bad. You don't convince them that they're doing wrong. You only convince them that you're yelling and screaming. And I think that we really have to think about how do we deliver advice to other people, and how do we create the expectation that people will act in a decent way, conduct themselves with integrity and civility and altruism. I think that's really important. And courage, because it takes courage to do that. It is so much easier to stand by and watch someone be abusive and talk about it later and say, oh, isn't that terrible? That was awful. Did you see that? Instead of saying, whoa, you know, we don't behave that way here. And it's really hard, because it's not only in selecting the leaders, it's in selecting everybody. And from my point of view, if you're a constituent, you are a leader at another level.
Because you're influencing.
Right. And if you have co-established this, if you have had a hand in this, and every day we are, you know, rebirthing organizations by the behavior that we engage in. So even if you weren't there at the founding of that institution, you were there in the daily regeneration of that organization or that institution or that workplace. So you have a responsibility, it seems to me. I think that we have to let people feel and have an expectation that they will act in a leader-like way. Because, you know, I started out as a sociologist, so I really believe in the power of roles. And roles are simply a set of expectations and responsibilities. And when we feel that we are expected to act in a certain way and that we have certain responsibilities. Most of us live up to this. And some other work that I do, which is sort of the other side of the mirror, if you will, on connective leadership, one aspect of connective leadership is what I call entrusting instrumental behavior, where you entrust an important part of what you're doing or your vision or whatever to somebody else. And you have an expectation that that person will, in fact, do that thing and do it well. And often, this is part of a ninefold repertoire of leadership behaviors that, taken together, constitute connective leadership. And often when I talk about entrusting behavior, people will come up to me or afterwards or raise their hand and say, well, I have a boss who does that. I mean, if you're entrusting, you give it to, and you could give something to a task, an important task, to anyone in this room without knowing a lot about their experience that would be relevant. And I would say 98.9% of the time, they would come through for you, and they would do something incredibly wonderful that they didn't even realize beforehand that they could do, because they had never done it before. And people will say, well, you know, I have a boss who does that to me all the time. You know, she gives me these things that I know nothing about, just throws it to me, and I have to catch it and run with it and do something, you know, terrific. And I always wish I had a video camera with me, because something interesting happens. I always, now I'm conducting my own little social science experiment. And so I say, well, and did you? They always, I say, how do you, I have two questions. I say, how do you feel, do you usually feel about it when you're first asked to do something? You know, something is entrusted to you that you've never done before, you know nothing about it. How do you feel? Exactly. People say, I'm scared, I'm anxious. And then my second question is, did you do it? And this is where the tape, you know, the video camera comes in. They stand up straighter. This happens all the time. And they say, oh, yes, I did the best thing I ever did in my life. It's that, and I call that leadership by expectation. When you expect people to do something positive and constructive, they will. And vice versa. If you expect bad things from people, that's exactly what you're going to get, because they understand that's what you're expecting and you will tolerate it.
Well, you know, I expect wonderful papers at the end of this course. You all know that, right? There's people may be attracted to this subject because they're suffering. Mm-hmm. Perhaps they're trapped in one of these situations where they're underneath a toxic leader. I wonder if you could look into the camera and provide some advice and counsel to those who may be trapped in one of those very unfortunate situations.
Yeah, that's really the nub of the issue, isn't it? And I think that's a very hard thing to do, because I'm not copying out, I will try to answer with emphasis on the try.
We have a Q&A. They'll bring you back.
Okay. I think it's hard to answer because each situation is so individual. And you can't, it isn't one answer fits all. But if I were to try to answer in broad strokes, I would say, first, do your homework. And by that I mean talk to other people, find out if this is a shared perception. You know, are you crazy? Are you imagining this? Or is this person, do other people experience this person the same way? If you find that other people share your perception, then I think it's important to create a coalition of like-minded people. because if you try to confront a toxic leader by yourself, it's really an exercise in futility.
Self-destruction, perhaps?
Yes, and I think it's a you said, he said kind of thing. I mean, and if you do confront a toxic leader, first build a coalition. And build a coalition very carefully. You know, don't call a town meeting. Do it one person at a time.
Because this is sometimes called in certain circles mutiny.
Yes, it can be seen as such, but I wouldn't particularly try to hide it. I don't believe in covert operations, particularly. I really do believe, particularly when you feel you have the angels on your side, that you do not have to deal in and engage in the behaviors that the toxic leader engages in order to offset the toxic leader. I remember long before I wrote this book, I was teaching a class and I was talking, I was obsessed with this idea. When you asked me why did I write the book, to get rid of my obsession. But I asked the question about why people didn't complain or unseat toxic leaders. And someone in the class, I'll never forget this, said, because then you'd have to stoop to the same level at which they operate in order to unseat them. And there was an audible gasp in the room. And I think that audible gasp said, no, that isn't so, that there are honorable ways to do it. And I don't think that in trying to correct a situation with a toxic leader that you should become toxic yourself. So I think that, one, you bring together like-minded people. I think that you bring people from different constituencies. You bring together, you talk to people who are your own peers. You talk to people who are peers of that person. If it's an organization, and this has to be staged very carefully. You don't do everything at once. It's, you put it together in a very strategic way. I think that you can confront the leader and say, and never, never go by yourself. Always take other people with you for two reasons. One, because you want to show the toxic leader that it's not just your opinion, that there are other people who perceive the leader the same way. That's number one. And two, you need witnesses so that whatever goes on in that room is seen not just by the two of you, but by other people too. And then I think you try to set if the person just throws you out of their office, his or her office, well, then you have to move in some other directions. But if the person says, well, I didn't realize that, I'm really sorry, I will try to do better, I think you try to help that person do better. You put together a strategy for that person with benchmarks that say, well, we'd like to see this, this, and this, and we'd like to see it by, this point in time and that point in time. And either offer, if there's somebody in the group who feels capable of doing this, to be that person's coach, or suggest that that person get a coach. Because I don't think people change all by themselves by looking in the mirror. Because it's very hard to see ourselves. When you stop and think about it, we can see everybody else directly. We can only see ourselves indirectly, which is a curious thing. The only way we can see ourselves is by looking in a mirror, either a literal mirror or the mirror that other people's eyes provide for us. So I think that those are things you have to do. At a later point, you might want to, if there's a board of that organization, involve the board. But again, I would do that very strategically. I would find out who knew some of the board the board members knew them in a personal way, so that if that person spoke to the board member, there would be trust. I mean, you can't go well, you can, but it's a lot harder to go as an unknown person to speak to a board member. Remember, the board appointed this person.
They're invested to some degree already in
Right.
this person.
They have appointed. And if it isn't the board, I mean, the same thing is going to that person's boss. It's an analogous situation. That person, not always, but most of the time, the boss has brought that person on. So I think you have to enlist the people above that person in the organization who can have some impact on that individual. I think these are things that you can do personally. I think and I would want to go to the board one at a time till I had a large enough coalition within the board to have a public meeting, or I don't mean public calling the world, but to bring the whole board together to address the issue. And sometimes that doesn't do it either. They don't want to hear it because they are invested, as George said, in that person's success. It says something about their powers of discernment for picking somebody like this. So that it's not so easy simply to tell the board that this person is corrupt or toxic. And remember, there's a chapter on the book called Odd Bedfellows or something like that, and it's about boards and the media. The boards and the media have a vested interest in keeping people like that going. From the media's point of view, it's very dangerous for them to write a negative story about a leader because most of the time they want that leader to give them access. They can't do their job unless they have access to the leader. And if they write a negative story, they are not going to have access. And the board, too, has additional reasons for not wanting to hear what you have to say. For one thing, the board is just as human as you are. And the board likes leaders for the same reason that the rest of us like them. They like being at the center of action. They like to be where important decisions are made. They like to feel that their life has meaning. And the leader is somebody who is supposedly the one who comes with ideas. And again, if we didn't think of leaders as being the ones who did this, we wouldn't get caught in this trap all the time. But as long as we continue to see leaders as the ones who are the major source of inspiration and ideas and creativity and new direction, we're going to get caught up in this. They like the excitement of being part of the board. It adds to their own personal cachet in other aspects of their lives. So they don't want to endanger their individual position on a board. I mean, I remember one time when I personally
Mounted a coup?
tried with a group of 8 other faculty people to talk to our board about the person who was my negative muse in this book. And I didn't know, I was assigned this person, and I was pretty naive. I didn't, I hadn't thought through the problem. If I had to do it now, I'd do it very differently.
You had read your